If you're settling in for the night right now, maybe lying down, maybe letting the quiet of your room finally catch up to you, this is the perfect moment to unwind with a story that's been whispered, debated, and revisited for more than 3 decades. Tonight, we're talking about the Menendez Brothers, a case that the world thought it understood, until the internet brought it back into the spotlight, reshaping public opinion one post, one documentary, one conversation at a time. But don't worry, this won't be dramatic or intense. We're going to take it slowly, calmly, almost like we're sitting in a dim room with soft rain in the background, unpacking the story piece by piece. Nothing harsh, nothing overwhelming. Just a gentle walk through history and perspective. So, let's start at the very beginning, the renewed interest part. Because this is one of the most fascinating things about true crime in the digital age, some stories don't fade. They sleep. And then suddenly, for reasons no one can fully predict, they wake back up. The Menendez case didn't just resurface, it came roaring back into public attention, especially among younger audiences who were nowhere near alive when the trials first aired on TV. This new wave of interest wasn't because of a new trial or newly discovered evidence, at least not initially. It was because of the internet doing what it does best, reframing narratives. People began sharing clips from the brothers' testimony, posting old interview footage, digging into trial transcripts, and asking questions that hadn't been part of the mainstream conversation in the early 90s. And part of why this caught fire again is simple: the story is complex. It involves family, fear, pressure, image, and the public's ongoing curiosity about what really goes on behind the perfect-looking facades people present to the world. Those themes hit differently today than they did decades ago. Back then, the world was more rigid in the way it interpreted right and wrong. Even courtroom TV felt more like entertainment than introspection. Today, people analyze emotional expression, trauma patterns, defense strategies, all with the benefit of modern psychological understanding. In other words, people aren't just revisiting the case, they're reinterpreting it. And maybe that's why the Menendez brothers have become a kind of tragic puzzle that people keep picking up again and again. Every new documentary, every social clip, every re-examination pulls someone new in. Someone who thinks, wait, this case isn't as simple as I thought. And that's exactly what sparked the wave of renewed interest over the past few years. But before we get into the trials, the family dynamics, and the reason this case refuses to stay buried, let's create a sense of place. Because to understand why the world reacted so intensely, you need to picture where it all started. Imagine Beverly Hills in the late 80s. Perfectly manicured lawns, polished driveways, a community that seemed almost frozen in a glossy kind of perfection. The Menendez home fit right into that image, large, elegant, outwardly successful. From the outside, it looked like the picture of the American dream: a wealthy family, 2 sons attending elite schools, a father with a powerful Hollywood career, and a mother known for her beauty and poise. Everything looked stable, unquestionably stable. And that illusion, that sense of, everything is fine, is one of the biggest reasons this case shocked the world the way it did. People weren't used to thinking that behind a beautiful exterior, something complicated, painful, or dysfunctional could exist. But as we've learned over time, shiny surfaces often hide the most difficult stories. And that's the space where our story begins, not in the courtroom, not in the headlines, but in the image of a family that seemed perfect from a distance. We'll walk through the moments that led up to the brothers' confessions, the public reactions, the legal battles, and the modern-day shift in perspective. But we'll do it slowly, gently, and with respect for the fact that you're here not just to learn the story but to feel safe while listening to it. So take a breath. Settle in, because Section 2 will take us into the early lives of Lyle and Eric, quietly, softly, and without anything graphic. Just context, history, and a closer look at how 2 brothers grew up in a world that looked flawless on the surface. As we ease into the next part of this story, think of this section as gently pulling back the curtains of the Menendez household. Not to expose anything dark or dramatic, but simply to understand the world these 2 brothers were born into. When you're listening to a case like this, especially in a calm, sleep-friendly space, the goal isn't shock. It's clarity, insight, a soft, steady frame for the rest of the story. So let's begin with the family itself. Lyle Menendez was born first, in 1968, followed by his younger brother, Eric, in 1970. Their parents, Jose and Kitty Menendez, were the kind of couple that looked successful in a way that seemed almost scripted. Jose had emigrated from Cuba as a teenager, and his rise to success in the United States was the kind of story that people admired deeply. He worked hard, extremely hard, and eventually climbed to a prominent position as an entertainment executive in Hollywood. He was sharp, ambitious, and respected. For anyone looking in from the outside, he looked like the embodiment of the American dream. Kitty, on the other hand, had once been a schoolteacher. She was known for her beauty, her presence, and her ability to host gatherings with the kind of seamless grace that made people feel instantly welcomed. She loved her sons fiercely, but like many parents navigating the pressure of maintaining a perfect image, she carried her own stresses and expectations. Together, they built a life that looked ideal. Beverly Hills mansions, high-end schools, tennis lessons, expensive cars, vacations that seemed to shimmer with privilege. If the picture had been a painting, it would have looked untouched, flawless, almost too polished to be real. And yet, as time has shown again and again, perfection is often a surface-level illusion. Lyle and Eric grew up in this environment, one where success was expected, image was everything, and pressure was woven subtly into the atmosphere. Friends of the family would later recall how the boys seemed to float between wanting their father's approval and fearing his disapproval. But to the outside world, this wasn't unusual. Families in high-achieving circles often operate under standards that feel more like rules than guidelines. One thing that shaped the brothers early on was how different they were from each other. Lyle, the older brother, was confident, vocal, and often took on the protector role. He was the type who entered a room and quickly figured out the social dynamics. He played tennis competitively and had ambitions that matched the expectations around him. Eric, by contrast, was softer spoken, more emotional, more introspective. He excelled at tennis too. Actually, many would say he was the more naturally talented athlete. But he carried himself with a quiet gentleness. Teachers described him as polite, sensitive, and sometimes anxious about doing things perfectly. He wanted to please people. He wanted peace, and he often looked up to Lyle for support. But what's important here, especially in this calm retelling, is how the brothers functioned as a unit. Despite their differences, Lyle and Eric were deeply bonded. Everything in their lives, school, sports, expectations, the rhythm of their home, pushed them together. That closeness would become significant later, both in the trials and in the renewed interest decades later, when people started re-evaluating the psychological dynamics of the family. As the boys grew up, the Menendez family moved from New Jersey to California, where Jose continued to rise in the entertainment world. The move was another layer of transition: new house, new community, new social expectations. Beverly Hills had its own culture, its own silent rules about status and appearance. The Menendez family fit in easily, almost automatically. But the pressure to remain perfect was always there, hanging in the air like an invisible weight. Kitty, too, felt this pressure. Friends noticed her struggling with anxiety and emotional exhaustion at times, but again, no one assumed anything beyond the stressful life of a high-profile family. People don't always look deeper when everything appears polished. When Lyle and Eric reached their teenage years, the expectations around them grew even stronger. They were supposed to excel academically, socially, athletically. Everything had to be a reflection of the Menendez image. And while the boys did work hard, they also carried the quiet strain of trying to meet standards that often felt unattainable. This early environment, structured, polished, pressurized, would later become a central part of the case. Not because of what was visible, but because of what wasn't. Much of what people discuss today, especially in the renewed wave of interest, revolves around the difference between how the family looked and how the family operated behind closed doors. For now, though, what matters is understanding the foundation: a powerful, high-achieving father, a stressed but devoted mother, two sons who were close, yet very different, a household that looked perfect from the outside, a picture that, at a glance, seemed unbreakable. In Section 3, we'll gently explore the turning points, the behaviors, choices, and events that slowly made cracks in that perfect image, leading up to the night that would change everything. As we move deeper into this story, imagine we're walking slowly through the Menendez family's timeline, not rushing, not dramatizing, just gently noticing the small shifts that eventually grew into something larger. True crime cases often focus on one big moment, but with this one, the story is really about the small things. The subtle changes, the quiet tensions, the little signs that something wasn't quite right, even if no one outside the home could see it. Because the truth is, families rarely fall apart in an instant. It happens gradually, like hairline cracks in glass, barely noticeable at first, but growing with each added pressure. In the Menendez household, those cracks began forming during the brothers' teenage years. On the outside, the changes looked perfectly normal, typical teenage rebellion, academic stress, and the kind of identity searching that most kids go through. But inside the family, those changes carried extra weight. When you grow up in a home built on high expectations, even small mistakes feel magnified. Even small uncertainties feel like failures. Take Lyle, for example. As he got older, he became more restless. Some friends described him as charming and social, but also unpredictable at times, driven by a need to prove himself, almost as though he was constantly trying to outrun some invisible pressure. He wanted success, he wanted approval, and he wanted a sense of control in a world where everything felt monitored. Eric, on the other hand, retreated inward. He had always been sensitive, but as a teen, that sensitivity deepened. He struggled with anxiety, with self-esteem, and with finding his place in environments where confidence often mattered more than authenticity. Tennis became both a passion and a pressure point for him. He was good, very good. But the more he excelled, the more he worried about failing. And the more he worried about failing, the harder it was to breathe under the weight of expectations. These growing differences in personality created a dynamic where the brothers needed each other even more. Lyle often stepped into the role of protector, while Eric leaned into Lyle's leadership. It wasn't unhealthy or unusual, it was simply the way they functioned. But it meant that when things began to go wrong, they felt it together. Intensely. In a way that fused their decisions and reactions. School added another layer of stress. Lyle struggled academically at times, which led to tension at home. Eric's anxiety also affected his performance, despite his intelligence. Their father's standards were high, extremely high, and anything that fell short created friction. But again, nothing outwardly alarming. Just the typical storminess of a high-pressure household. Eventually, though, the boys started acting out. Not dramatically, but in ways that suggested a release valve snapping under too much buildup. There were instances of minor trouble, shoplifting, academic dishonesty, rebellious behavior, that hinted at internal conflict. Many teens go through such phases. What made it different here was the intensity of the reactions, both from the boys and from their parents. Jose, with his strict and demanding nature, responded firmly. Kitty, already anxious and emotionally stretched, reacted with her own sense of fear and frustration. The household atmosphere grew tighter, heavier, as though every disagreement added another brick to an already weighted structure. Friends, teachers, and acquaintances saw some of the tension, but nothing that looked extreme or dangerous. Just a family trying to maintain an image while emotions quietly swirled beneath the surface. What's interesting is how the renewed interest in the case brought this period under a new lens. In the early 90s, the brothers' teenage turbulence was framed as defiance. Today, with a better understanding of emotional health, people look at the same history and see signs of fear, pressure, confusion, and deep internal stress. Context changes meaning, and meaning shapes perception. But even with these cracks forming, the family's outward image remained pristine. No one on the outside suspected how strained the relationships inside the home had become. The polished Beverly Hills facade still held. Perfect house, perfect lawn, perfect narrative. It's this contrast, the glossy outside against the pressured inside, that makes the Menendez story so haunting for many people. When there's a mismatch between appearance and reality, it becomes easy for important signs to be missed. Or dismissed. Or hidden. By the time the brothers reached their late teens, the cracks had widened. Emotional distance grew, arguments grew, stress grew, and the family dynamic began to feel less like a household and more like a pressure chamber. But even then, the breaking point hadn't arrived. Not yet. In Section 4, we'll move gently toward the series of events that led up to the night that changed the Menendez family forever, but still with soft pacing, non-graphic detail, and a calm, sleep-friendly tone. As we drift into this next part of the story, imagine we're standing just outside the Menendez home in late summer of 1989. The air feels still, the neighborhood is quiet, and the house, this large, elegant Beverly Hills residence, looks perfectly ordinary. Peaceful, even. Nothing about its exterior suggests that anything turbulent is happening inside. But as we've already seen, appearances rarely tell the full story. In the days leading up to the night that would bring the Menendez family into the national spotlight, the brothers' lives were continuing on a path that felt both familiar and increasingly unstable. Lyle was home from college, where he'd struggled academically and socially. Eric was preparing for another tennis tournament, trying to focus despite growing anxiety and an emotional heaviness that friends later noticed but didn't fully understand. During this period, the family dynamic had become tense. Conversations weren't just conversations, they were weighted. Decisions weren't just decisions, they felt like verdicts. And the pressure that had been building for years now pressed down harder than ever. For Lyle, being back home meant facing expectations he had tried to outrun at college. His father had a specific vision for him, and that vision didn't include uncertainty. He needed Lyle to be sharp, ambitious, poised for success. But Lyle wasn't feeling that. He was restless, unsure, caught between wanting independence and wanting approval. The tension sat heavily on him. For Eric, the tension manifested differently. He withdrew, grew quieter, more anxious. Tennis had once been an escape for him, a place where the rhythm of movement soothed his mind, but now even that felt overwhelming. He was competing well, but emotionally, he felt fragile. Friends noticed he seemed distracted, tired, and easily startled. These changes didn't go unnoticed at home. Kitty was already emotionally stretched thin, and her worries magnified everything. She wanted harmony, stability, and order. But balancing her husband's expectations and her son's emotional needs was becoming more than she could manage. She felt pulled in opposite directions, each one requiring more of her energy than she had available. And Jose, a man whose drive had built his success, continued to push forward with the same intensity that had shaped the family for years. His method was structure, discipline, results. But sometimes structure becomes pressure, and pressure becomes strain. That's where the family was during these final days, caught between holding together and quietly coming undone. The days themselves were ordinary. Errands, tennis practices, small household routines. But beneath the day-to-day surface, conversations grew shorter, sharper. The emotional atmosphere thickened, like humidity before a storm. The brothers began spending more time together, often leaving the house for long drives or late-night talks. They relied on each other even more heavily, forming a kind of protective orbit. People close to the family later recalled that something felt off, but no one could pinpoint exactly what it was. The Menendez home still looked picture-perfect from the outside. The family still appeared successful and composed. Nothing looked alarming enough for someone to step in or ask deeper questions. That's one of the haunting truths about this case. The signs were there, but none of them looked big enough to disrupt the illusion. In sleep-friendly storytelling, this is often where we pause, reminding ourselves that real families aren't mysteries waiting to be solved. They're complex, layered, and sometimes struggling silently. The Menendez family was no different. Everyone inside that house was dealing with their own internal storm, but each storm was quiet enough that it never spilled into public view. As these final days passed, Lyle and Eric became more emotionally overwhelmed. Their sleep patterns were off. Their moods fluctuated. They were scared, conflicted, and unsure of how to cope with the mounting pressure inside their home life. Yet to the outside world, nothing looked wrong. People saw them at restaurants, at tennis events, running errands, laughing with friends. The mask held firmly, even as the fractures beneath it widened. And then came the night that would change everything. A night that would launch years of legal battles, decades of public debate, and, eventually, a massive wave of renewed interest fueled by modern psychological understanding. But in this calm retelling, we don't rush toward that moment. We walk gently. We make space to understand the emotional landscape before anything happened. Because understanding the pressures and the relationships helps us understand the case itself. As we move into this section, remember that this is a sleep-friendly version of the story. That means we keep things calm, non-graphic, and focused on the emotional and factual outline rather than anything distressing. Think of this as passing through an important historical moment with quiet, respectful distance, like looking at it through frosted glass. By late August 1989, the Menendez family was moving through a tense but outwardly normal stretch of days. There had been arguments, moments of discomfort, and long silences, but nothing that neighbors or acquaintances found unusual. A family living under pressure often looks exactly like any other family. Routines continue, chores get done, schedules are kept. People don't usually notice when a breaking point is near. On the night everything changed, the Menendez brothers were at home with their parents for part of the evening. The details of the timeline are well documented in court records and testimony, but in this calm retelling, we focus on the emotional atmosphere rather than the dramatic elements. It was a typical Beverly Hills night, warm, quiet, still. The kind of evening where the world feels paused. Inside the house, the family's routine carried on in its familiar, structured way. Jose and Kitty were winding down for the night. Lyle and Eric, feeling increasingly overwhelmed in the days leading up to that evening, were restless. They left the house for a while, driving around the city as brothers often do when they need space to breathe and think. During this period, the boys were caught in a storm of fear and panic, a feeling that had been building over months. They were anxious, emotional, and unsure of what to do. Later testimony would reveal that they felt trapped, confused, and deeply afraid of what might happen next in their household. Their emotions were spinning faster than they could process. The brothers eventually returned home. What happened afterward became the center of one of the most talked about trials in American history. What's important for our peaceful retelling is not the dramatic content, but the shift, the moment when everything in their family's carefully maintained image suddenly collapsed. A call was made to 911 later that night. Lyle was the one who dialed. His voice on that call, which would later be played in courtrooms and documentaries, was frantic and panicked. It is still one of the most well-known elements of the case, not because of what happened, but because of how raw that call sounded, a moment of pure emotional unraveling. When police arrived, they found the house unexpectedly silent. The calm exterior of the Beverly Hills mansion contrasted sharply with the chaos inside. The boys were outside the home, distressed, crying, overwhelmed. Officers later described them as inconsolable and visibly shocked. In those first hours, the police didn't immediately suspect the brothers. The emotional intensity they displayed seemed genuine. They were taken in for questioning, but at that early stage they were treated more like witnesses than suspects. Meanwhile, the news of the incident began to ripple through Beverly Hills, quietly at first, then with more intensity. A high-profile family, a stunning home, and a sudden tragedy create a kind of echo in a community. People start whispering, speculating, wondering, but for that first night, and for several days afterward, the brothers were not seen as perpetrators. They stayed at a hotel, surrounded by relatives and supported by friends. Their behavior was described as shaken, terrified, and frail. They cried often. They barely slept. Their emotional state appeared fragile, which aligned with how they'd been acting in the weeks prior. To many people watching them, they looked like two young men who had just experienced the most devastating moment of their lives. And yet, beneath that emotional collapse, there were inconsistencies that detectives slowly began to notice. Nothing dramatic, nothing immediate, just small things. Details that didn't quite add up, behaviors that felt out of sync with the timeline. Investigators began looking more closely at the brothers' statements, their movements, and the events leading up to the night. But at this stage, the story wasn't about suspicion. It was about shock. A family that had looked perfect from the outside, shattered. A community known for luxury and calm, rattled. Two brothers, barely adults, standing in the center of a tragedy they could barely comprehend, emotionally or otherwise. The night marked not only the end of life as they knew it, but also the beginning of a years-long legal journey that would unfold in front of the entire country, one that would reveal details, accusations, and testimonies that still spark debate more than 30 years later. The morning after the tragedy, Beverly Hills woke up to a quiet ripple of news. Something serious had happened at the Menendez residence, but details were scarce. Police were cautious, neighbors were whispering, and the world outside the mansion felt strangely still. This calm after the storm atmosphere sets the tone for what unfolded in the days that followed. For Lyle and Eric, those first days were a blur of grief, confusion, and overwhelming emotion. They stayed at a nearby hotel with extended family, where relatives tried to comfort them and shield them from the growing curiosity outside. To everyone around them, the brothers seemed fragile, exhausted, tearful, barely functioning. They cried often, paced hallways, and struggled to sleep. What happened inside their home had shaken them to the core. And for a while, investigators believed them. In fact, during those initial days, most detectives treated the brothers like survivors, not suspects. Their emotional breakdown looked sincere. Their stories, at least on the surface, sounded consistent. Their parents had no known enemies, no obvious threats, no footprints pointing clearly to someone else. Everything about the situation felt like a sudden, unexplained tragedy. But as detectives walked through the Menendez home, something subtle but important happened. Quiet, careful observation. The officers weren't looking for a culprit yet, they were simply trying to understand what had happened. But little details stood out. Things that felt out of place. Things that didn't fully match the emotional narrative the brothers were giving. Not enough to accuse anyone, but enough to take mental notes. Meanwhile, Lyle and Eric's behavior in public drew mixed interpretations. On one hand, their grief looked genuine. On the other hand, certain actions raised eyebrows in hindsight, though it's important to note that grief affects people differently, unpredictably, and sometimes strangely. For example, within days, the brothers began making large purchases. Expensive cars, costly clothes, luxurious items. At the time, they later claimed it was a way of coping, a kind of emotional escape after experiencing something traumatic. But to investigators, these choices felt inconsistent with mourning. That inconsistency wasn't proof of anything, but it added another small question mark to the growing list. Still, no one made any accusations. Not yet. During these days, police continued to interview the brothers gently, giving them space to express shock and fear. The brothers offered explanations for their whereabouts, their emotions, and their reactions. And each explanation seemed mostly plausible. Mostly, but as detectives compared notes, subtle inconsistencies began to appear in the timelines and details. Nothing dramatic, just small shifts in phrasing or memory. A detail that slipped. A detail that changed slightly in a later retelling. A detail that didn't match the physical evidence exactly. None of this was enough to point fingers, but it was enough to push investigators to look more closely. Meanwhile, the brothers' emotional states continued to fluctuate. They were still crying often, still visibly distressed, still speaking with tremors in their voices. Friends described them as lost and inconsolable. No one around them was ready to suspect them of anything. Even close family members repeatedly defended them when whispers began circulating. But this is the moment in many true crime stories, and especially in this one, where the emotional atmosphere begins to shift. Slowly. Quietly. There's no dramatic turning point, no sudden accusation. Instead, detectives simply start looking at the brothers with a different lens. Not accusatory, just observant. They began reviewing the brothers' purchases, looking deeper into their financial habits, examining their relationships, their recent stressors, their fears. They revisited the timeline of that night again and again, looking for clarity. And as they did, the inconsistencies grew more noticeable. At the same time, the community around the brothers continued trying to comfort them. Sympathy poured in. People brought food, offered hugs, and expressed sorrow for the unimaginable pain the boys were experiencing. No one on the outside suspected they could be involved. This contrast, public sympathy and private suspicion, shaped the days that followed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't confrontational. It was subtle, gradual, and quiet, the kind of shift that feels inevitable only in hindsight. Detectives continued talking to the brothers. Gently, carefully, patiently, but with each conversation, they began leaning a little closer to the possibility that this wasn't an outside threat. Still, nothing concrete, nothing definitive, but the atmosphere had changed. And the brothers could feel it. In Section 7, we'll explore how the investigation intensified, how the brothers' behavior evolved under pressure, and the moment the case took a sharp turn, still calmly, non-graphically, and sleep-friendly. As investigators continued piecing together the Menendez case, things began to shift from confusion to clarity, but in a very slow, quiet way, almost like watching puzzle pieces finally settle into place. Detectives weren't storming rooms or chasing suspects. Instead, they were methodically revisiting every detail, trying to understand the emotional undercurrents inside the Menendez home. And in these calmer moments of the investigation, the story becomes less about the crime and more about the lives behind it. Police circled back to friends, coaches, tutors, and even distant relatives, people who had been connected to Eric and Lyle during the years leading up to the tragedy. Many described the brothers as polite, well-spoken, and outwardly privileged, yet often carrying a kind of tension that didn't quite fit their seemingly perfect lifestyle. These weren't red flags, in the typical investigative sense, more like quiet observations that made the bigger picture feel a little less straightforward. Detectives also began looking at family dynamics, not to sensationalize them, but simply to understand what life inside that Beverly Hills mansion might have been like. They reviewed school records, therapy notes, and interviews from people who interacted with the Menendez parents professionally. Everything was handled slowly, thoughtfully, almost academically. It wasn't a hunt for gossip, it was a search for clarity. At the same time, Eric's internal struggle continued beneath the surface. While Lyle appeared outwardly composed, Eric was increasingly anxious. Friends later described him as someone who carried emotions just under the surface, someone who felt pressure intensely. During this stage of the investigation, the brothers weren't suspects yet, just two young men trying to navigate interviews, grief, and an increasingly curious public gaze. As detectives kept revisiting timelines, they noticed small inconsistencies, not major breaks in the story, but subtle shifts. Answers that changed slightly, feelings that seemed rehearsed. And in the quiet of those interview rooms, their attention sharpened. That's when they began looking more closely at the brothers' behavior following the tragedy, the sudden purchases, the social outings, and the attempts to regain a sense of normalcy. It's easy to assume these actions were evidence of guilt, but investigators approached it with more nuance. Trauma, especially sudden trauma, can make people behave in unpredictable ways. What looked unusual could have been coping, or avoidance, or simply two young men trying to anchor themselves after their world fell apart. Detectives didn't rush to conclusions, they just kept gathering information, one careful step at a time. By now, the case was becoming heavier, not in a dramatic way, but in that slow, thoughtful way where you start sensing that something deeper is stirring beneath the surface. Interviews were becoming longer, notes were becoming thicker, and the brothers, who had initially been protected from suspicion by sympathy, were slowly being observed with a different lens. Not judged, just examined more closely. This phase of the investigation is one of the calmest in the whole story, almost quiet enough for sleep. There were no big twists, no loud confrontations, just a gradual tightening of the narrative as investigators tried to reconcile the outward image of the family with the undercurrents they were beginning to uncover. And it's here that the story transitions gently into the next chapter. The moment when a single conversation, soft-spoken, emotional, and completely unexpected, changes everything. As the investigation quietly deepened, something unexpected began taking shape far from police offices and interview rooms. It didn't happen during an interrogation or under the pressure of harsh questioning. Instead, it unfolded in a space meant for trust and emotional release. And this moment, gentle, vulnerable, and deeply human, would go on to reshape the entire case. Eric Menendez, the younger of the two brothers, had been carrying a noticeable emotional weight from the very beginning. While Lyle often stepped naturally into a protective, older brother role, Eric was more sensitive, more anxious, and more overwhelmed by the aftermath of the tragedy. His friends would later describe him as someone who never managed to fully settle, even in moments of rest. And it was during this emotional turmoil that he turned to someone he trusted, his psychologist, Dr. Jerome Oziel. The sessions were supposed to help Eric process grief. Slowly, gently, and with the privacy that therapy is meant to offer. And at first, that's exactly what they were. Eric talking in circles around his emotions, trying to navigate his fear and confusion. But as the weeks went on, the pressure inside him began to shift. You can almost imagine the atmosphere in that therapy room, not dramatic, not explosive, just quiet. A space where the silence itself feels heavy. Eventually, something in Eric softened. In one of those sessions, without any force or confrontation, he revealed the truth of what had happened that night. The confession didn't come out as a bold declaration. It came out slowly, unevenly, like someone releasing years of fear, guilt, and tangled emotion. His words would later become the turning point of the entire case. But here's the part that often surprises people. This confession wasn't immediately handed over to the police. Legally and ethically, therapy sessions are confidential. They are meant to protect vulnerability, not punish it. For a time, Dr. Oziel held this information privately, unsure of how to navigate the ethical complexities of what he'd heard. And in this quiet pause, a kind of holding space, the entire case hung in the balance. What shifted everything wasn't just the confession itself, but what happened around it. Dr. Oziel later shared the information with his partner, someone who felt fear and urgency about the revelation. That conversation, happening outside the bounds of confidentiality, traveled further than Oziel expected. Soon, it reached someone who felt compelled to notify authorities. And just like that, the detectives who had been painstakingly gathering evidence were handed a thread that would change the direction of the investigation entirely. When police learned of the confession, it didn't create an explosive moment. Instead, it deepened the emotional complexity of the case. Investigators began seeing the brothers not just as young men under suspicion, but as individuals carrying an overwhelming burden, one that had only now come into focus. From this point forward, the tone of the investigation shifted. Not louder, but clearer. The detectives had been navigating a maze of grief, privilege, contradictions, and confusion. Now, for the first time, there was a path, still winding, still layered, but undeniably leading somewhere. And as the case began moving forward with this new knowledge, the story entered a phase that would spark national attention, courtroom debates, and conversations that continue even decades later. After the confession to Dr. Oziel made its way to law enforcement, the Menendez brothers' lives shifted dramatically. What had been private fear and emotional turmoil now entered the public eye, slowly at first, then with increasing intensity. And yet, even with all the attention, the story unfolds more like a complex emotional landscape than a dramatic spectacle. In this gentle retelling, we'll focus on the context, the personalities, and the careful unfolding of events rather than shocking details. The trials didn't begin immediately. There were months of preparation, interviews, and legal maneuvering. The brothers were represented by attorneys who spent countless hours reviewing transcripts, studying timelines, and preparing for what would become one of the most high-profile cases in California history. Courtroom proceedings, while heavily covered in the media, were methodical and precise. Each detail was examined, each word weighed, and each testimony carefully considered. In the early stages, public interest grew steadily. Beverly Hills had always been a community noted for appearances and wealth, and here was a family whose story suddenly revealed layers of tension, pressure, and private struggle. Television networks, newspapers, and magazines began reporting on the case, but much of the coverage focused on the human side. Two brothers trying to navigate extraordinary circumstances, the family's history, and the psychological dynamics that led to such a dramatic outcome. During this time, the brothers' emotional states remained fragile. Lyle, who often presented a composed exterior, now faced months of legal scrutiny. He had to recount events repeatedly, sitting in quiet, formal rooms while attorneys asked the same questions over and over. Eric, naturally more sensitive, had to confront public attention on top of personal fear and grief. The brothers were young men under intense observation, and their emotional burden was enormous. Even small moments, repeating a timeline, answering a question incorrectly, or reacting in ways that seemed unusual, became part of the public record. Psychologists and experts were brought in to evaluate the brothers, offering professional insight into their behaviors, emotions, and motivations. These evaluations became part of the trial records, and while much of the coverage sensationalized aspects of the case, the underlying themes were very human: fear, pressure, anxiety, and the challenge of making sense of a world that suddenly seemed impossible to navigate. The trial itself stretched over many months, and what drew attention wasn't just the facts but the personalities involved. Lyle and Eric had to sit in the courtroom daily, hearing witnesses recounting moments from their lives and the family's history. The public watched closely, forming opinions and debating morality, intent, and responsibility. Yet for all the external noise, inside the courtroom, the process was meticulous and deliberate. Lawyers, jurors, and judges worked to understand not only what had occurred but why, and how the psychological and emotional context of the family's life played into every decision. This phase of the case is also where renewed interest in recent years finds its roots. People who revisit the Menendez story today are often fascinated not by the sensational headlines but by the human complexity. What drives siblings to protect each other? How does pressure and expectation shape emotional responses? And how do the gaps between outward appearances and private reality influence decisions? These questions resonate now, more than ever, as viewers and researchers analyze court footage, interviews, and documentaries. Even as the trial proceedings unfolded, the story retained an unusual tension, a quiet, almost reflective quality. The brothers, their parents, the lawyers, and the jurors were all part of a system striving for clarity and justice. It was procedural, it was structured, and it demanded focus, patience, and careful observation, qualities that resonate perfectly in a sleep-friendly retelling, where drama is replaced by contemplation and insight. By the time the trial ended, public opinion had already been shaped by years of reporting, analysis, and debate. The Menendez brothers had become symbols in discussions about family dynamics, mental health, and the ways privilege and pressure intersect. Even decades later, the case invites analysis, reflection, and discussion, which is why it continues to surface in documentaries, social media conversations, and renewed interest from curious audiences. As the trial concluded, the world watched carefully. Lyle and Eric Menendez, after months of testimony, witness accounts, and expert evaluations, were facing the legal consequences of their actions. The courtroom, which had been a place of meticulous examination for so long, now prepared to deliver its judgment. And while much of the public had already formed opinions, the process remained deliberate, slow, and formal, just like the careful retelling we're sharing now. The verdict brought clarity in a legal sense, but emotionally, it was far more layered. For the brothers, life as they had known it was irrevocably changed. They were young men facing decades-long prison sentences, yet their story didn't end with anger or spectacle. Instead, it entered a quiet phase of reflection and adaptation. In prison, both began to grapple with their past, the consequences of their choices, and the family dynamics that had shaped them. Time, routine, and structured reflection became central to their new reality. Public interest, however, didn't fade. Over the years, documentaries, books, podcasts, and social media analyses continued to explore the Menendez story. Some focused on the legal angles, others on psychological perspectives, and still others on the contrast between appearances and hidden realities. The renewed attention decades later wasn't just about the events themselves. It was about understanding the human complexities that led to them. Viewers and researchers alike became fascinated by the ways pressure, fear, and family dynamics could influence behavior. Interestingly, the story's endurance owes much to its relatability and mystery. Almost everyone can understand the tension of trying to meet expectations or navigate complex family relationships. And when those pressures are amplified by wealth, public attention, or isolation, the consequences can be profound. In revisiting the Menendez brothers' story today, audiences are drawn not to sensationalism, but to empathy, curiosity, and the deeper questions of human behavior. The Menendez case also serves as a reflection on modern discussions about mental health, trauma, and justice. It reminds us that appearances can be deceiving and that understanding a person's choices often requires a careful look at context, emotion, and history. While the verdict provided legal closure, the public conversation continues in more nuanced, reflective ways, decades later. For those listening tonight, it's useful to think about the Menendez story not as a source of fear or shock, but as an exploration of human complexity. Families can appear perfect on the outside while carrying invisible struggles. Young people can be caught between loyalty, fear, and pressure in ways that are hard for outsiders to see. And, ultimately, actions have consequences, but those consequences are intertwined with stories, emotions, and circumstances that unfold over years. As we close this section and near the end of our story, take a moment to reflect on the calm rhythm of the Menendez timeline. The quiet growth of tension, the subtle cracks in a seemingly perfect home, the gentle unfolding of events that eventually led to public and legal scrutiny. It's a story not of instant drama, but of cumulative human experience, layered, intricate, and enduring. The renewed interest in the Menendez brothers reminds us that stories like these never fully disappear. They resurface, not to shock, but to teach, reflect, and inspire understanding. And while the brothers themselves live far from the public eye now, their story continues to spark conversation and reflection, decades after the initial events. So tonight, as you settle deeper into your bed, consider the story of Lyle and Eric Menendez in this calm light. A story about family, pressure, and the ways human lives can be complicated beyond what the surface shows. And let that reflection gently guide you toward rest, understanding, and a quiet, peaceful sleep. Even decades after the trial concluded, the Menendez case continues to capture attention. In recent years, younger generations, many of whom were not alive during the original trial, have discovered the story through documentaries, podcasts, and social media. This renewed interest doesn't focus solely on the sensational aspects of the case. Instead, people are drawn to the psychological and emotional dynamics that shaped the brothers' lives, the pressures within the family, and the lessons the story offers about human behavior. Modern re-examinations often consider the brothers' upbringing, their responses to stress, and how family dynamics influence decisions. Psychologists, sociologists, and everyday viewers alike analyze transcripts, interviews, and trial footage, trying to understand how two young men could reach such a critical turning point in their lives. The renewed interest has also sparked debates about mental health awareness, childhood trauma, and the broader question of how society interprets and judges behavior. One reason the story resonates today is its relatability on a human level. Many people have experienced the tension of family expectations, the anxiety of balancing conflicting pressures, or the weight of trying to meet standards that feel unattainable. While the Menendez brothers' story is extreme in outcome, the emotions underlying it, fear, frustration, confusion, and loyalty, are universally understandable. This makes it a topic that continues to provoke reflection and discussion. Documentaries released in recent years have emphasized a balanced perspective. They explore both the legal and emotional aspects of the story, giving viewers insight into the pressures of the Menendez household, the brothers' experiences, and the societal reaction to the case. These productions avoid graphic details, focusing instead on understanding context, perspective, and the human elements behind the headlines. Social media, too, has played a role in the resurgence of interest. Clips of courtroom testimony, interviews with family friends, and discussions of legal strategy circulate widely, often accompanied by questions about morality, accountability, and psychological factors. Commenters frequently express surprise at the contrast between the family's outward appearance and the hidden tension within the home. They debate what might have been preventable, how warning signs could have been addressed, and what lessons can be drawn from the story today. For viewers listening tonight, this modern re-examination serves as a gentle reminder: history isn't static, and understanding evolves with time. As social perspectives shift and knowledge of psychology grows, stories like the Menendez case can be revisited with nuance, curiosity, and a focus on the deeper human truths rather than sensationalism. The renewed interest also highlights how media shapes perception. Early coverage focused on shock value and courtroom drama, while today's audience is often more reflective, interested in emotional context, ethical considerations, and the complex layers of family dynamics. This evolution in focus allows for a calmer, more analytical view of the story, perfect for those listening to unwind and reflect before sleep. Ultimately, the Menendez case, as re-examined today, encourages empathy and thoughtful analysis. It invites viewers to look beyond headlines, question assumptions, and consider the interplay between upbringing, personality, and circumstance. It's a story about people, not just events, a story that continues to resonate because it reveals the subtle complexities of life hidden behind a perfectly polished exterior. As the Menendez case settled into history, it left a series of lasting reflections on law, psychology, and public perception. Beyond the courtroom drama, the story provides insight into how family dynamics, emotional pressures, and personal coping mechanisms can intersect in ways that have profound consequences. One key lesson is the importance of understanding emotional and psychological context. Lyle and Eric's actions cannot be fully appreciated without considering the environment in which they grew up, a household marked by high expectations, intense pressure, and complex relationships. Modern psychological studies, revisited in the wake of renewed interest, emphasize that behavior, especially under extreme stress, is rarely simple or one-dimensional. The case invites viewers to explore the nuanced ways that upbringing, fear, and loyalty can shape decision-making. The story also offers perspective on criminal responsibility and the legal system's approach to mitigating factors. While the law focuses on clear actions and consequences, cases like this show how background, family history, and psychological stressors are carefully weighed during trials. Evaluations by psychologists, expert testimonies, and detailed analysis of childhood experiences all contribute to understanding why events unfolded as they did. For the public, this aspect of the case highlights the delicate balance between justice and compassion, and how nuanced human experiences influence legal outcomes. Beyond the courtroom, the Menendez case has had cultural and societal impact. It sparked conversations about family secrecy, emotional trauma, and the pressures of maintaining appearances. People began to question how much weight to give to external impressions versus internal realities. The story reminds us that what a family looks like from the outside may not reflect the true complexities of life within. This awareness encourages empathy, reflection, and careful consideration before making judgments, lessons that remain relevant across generations. The case also serves as a reminder of the role of media and public perception. Initial news coverage focused heavily on sensational elements, while modern examinations take a more analytical, compassionate view. The evolution of coverage demonstrates how understanding deepens over time, especially as cultural awareness of mental health and family dynamics improves. Today, the Menendez story is often discussed in the context of psychology, ethics, and social commentary, rather than solely crime and punishment. Finally, for listeners reflecting on the case tonight, it's helpful to remember that stories like this are not simply cautionary tales. They are invitations to explore human behavior with patience, curiosity, and empathy. Lyle and Eric's lives were shaped by complex emotional factors, and while their actions had serious consequences, understanding the context offers insight into the broader human experience. It's a reminder that every individual carries unseen pressures, and that compassion and awareness are vital tools in interpreting the world around us. Even decades after the original trial, the Menendez brothers remain a subject of public curiosity. What started as a local tragedy evolved into a national story, and now, through documentaries, podcasts, and social media discussions, it has become a case study in human behavior, family dynamics, and the complexities of justice. The enduring interest isn't about sensationalism. It's about understanding the subtle layers beneath the surface. One reason the story resonates is the contrast between appearance and reality. The Menendez family lived in a wealthy, seemingly ideal household in Beverly Hills, a place often associated with perfection and luxury. Yet inside, the brothers experienced emotional tension, pressure, and a sense of fear that few outside the home could perceive. That duality, what the world sees versus what individuals experience, strikes a chord because it's something many people intuitively understand. Families are complicated, lives are complicated, and sometimes, appearances can be deceiving. Media coverage over the years has also contributed to the fascination. Early reports focused on shocking headlines, but modern storytelling often emphasizes the psychological and emotional context. Viewers today explore the Menendez story with a focus on human complexity. How did the brothers cope with long-standing pressure? What were the subtle signs that something was amiss? How do societal expectations, privilege, and family dynamics intersect? This shift in focus allows audiences to reflect rather than react, turning the case into a contemplative study rather than a source of shock. Podcasts and documentaries highlight another interesting dimension, the variability of human perception. Different witnesses and experts interpret the same events in varying ways, and this diversity of perspective has fueled decades of debate. Listeners and viewers are encouraged to consider multiple angles, cultivating critical thinking and empathy. In a calm, reflective sense, this is what makes the story enduring. It's not just about what happened, but about how we interpret behavior, motives, and consequences. The ongoing fascination also underscores society's interest in ethical questions. The case raises issues about justice, accountability, and the interplay between upbringing and decision-making. While the brothers faced legal consequences, the broader questions persist. How much do family dynamics shape actions? How should society consider emotional and psychological context in evaluating behavior? These questions remain relevant, and the Menendez case continues to serve as a reference point in discussions about morality, psychology, and justice. For those listening tonight, the lesson is gentle but clear. Public fascination often stems from a desire to understand, to analyze, and to connect emotionally with stories that reflect deep human truths. The Menendez story, revisited over decades, provides a way to consider the complexities of life and relationships in a calm, reflective manner. It allows us to think about empathy, nuance, and the unseen pressures that influence choices, all without the need for sensationalism or fear. As we reach the final part of the Menendez story, it's helpful to step back and consider the broader lessons and the lasting legacy this case has left behind. Unlike stories told for shock or drama, this reflection focuses on understanding, empathy, and the quiet complexity of human life. The Menendez case reminds us that appearances are often misleading. From the outside, the family seemed affluent, successful, and perfect, in the way Beverly Hills homes are often portrayed in media. But beneath that surface lay complex emotions, tensions, and pressures that were invisible to neighbors, friends, and even teachers. The story invites us to recognize that every household carries layers of unseen dynamics and that understanding those layers requires patience and care. It also highlights the importance of context in interpreting behavior. Lyle and Eric Menendez were shaped by years of emotional stress, complicated relationships, and a profound sense of loyalty to each other. Their actions cannot be fully understood without considering the psychological and environmental factors at play. While their decisions had serious consequences, the case encourages us to think beyond simple labels of good or bad, reminding us that human behavior is rarely straightforward. The ongoing fascination with the case, from court coverage to modern documentaries, podcasts, and social media discussions, underscores society's desire to understand complexity. People are drawn to stories where morality, psychology, and circumstance intersect because they reflect questions we ask in our own lives. How do pressure and expectation shape choices? How do loyalty and fear influence decisions? How do unseen emotional experiences affect behavior? These questions remain compelling because they are universal, even when the outcomes are extreme. Moreover, the Menendez story demonstrates the evolving nature of public perception. Initial coverage focused heavily on sensational elements, but later analyses, documentaries, and academic perspectives emphasize nuance, emotional context, and reflective understanding. This evolution shows how time, knowledge, and empathy can transform the way we engage with difficult stories. For listeners tonight, the Menendez story serves as a gentle reminder. Human experiences are layered, complex, and often hidden beneath surfaces that seem calm and orderly. Reflection, curiosity, and empathy are tools we can use to better understand not just historical cases, but the people around us in everyday life. As you drift toward sleep, consider the Menendez story in this soft, reflective light, not as a tale of horror, but as a study of family, psychology, and human complexity. Let the quiet rhythm of events, the subtle emotional currents, and the lessons of context and empathy guide your thoughts toward rest. In understanding these layers, we cultivate awareness and compassion, qualities that extend far beyond any single story. And with that, our journey through the Menendez story comes to a calm, thoughtful close. The events, the trials, and the reflections remain, not as a source of fear or sensationalism, but as a mirror for understanding human behavior in its many dimensions. As we bring this story to a close, it's important to pause and consider what remains after the headlines fade. the human truths, the quiet lessons, and the enduring reflections. The Menendez case, with all its complexity and public scrutiny, offers insight into how family, pressure, and emotional experiences shape lives in ways that are not always visible. One of the most enduring lessons is the value of empathy. Listening to the story calmly, without sensationalism, allows us to see Lyle and Eric not just as figures in a headline, but as young people caught in a web of fear, expectation, and emotion. Their choices were consequential, yes, but their experiences are also deeply human. Understanding them requires patience, reflection, and a willingness to consider the unseen pressures that affect people's actions. The story also reminds us of the hidden layers in every family. Outside appearances can be comforting, orderly, or even flawless, but inside, complex emotions and tensions may be quietly unfolding. Observing these stories in a calm, reflective way encourages awareness and thoughtfulness in our own lives, helping us recognize that every person has struggles we may not see. Finally, the Menendez story underscores the passage of time and how perspectives evolve. What was once shocking becomes a case study. What was once sensationalized can now be viewed through a lens of psychology, human behavior, and ethical reflection. This evolution teaches us that understanding takes time, and that stories, like people, are rarely one-dimensional. As you settle into the quiet of your evening, let the rhythm of this narrative guide you toward calm and reflection. Imagine the slow passage of days, the unfolding of events with clarity and patience, and the subtle lessons that emerge when we look beneath the surface. This is a story not just about events, but about understanding, about seeing the human experience with nuance, depth, and empathy. And now, with the Menendez story gently laid before you, allow your mind to drift into a space of peaceful contemplation. Let the details fade into soft awareness, leaving behind the calm understanding that life is complex, that people are layered, and that reflection is a path to insight.